Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. This is the Spyderco Hanan. First off though, in the name of full disclosure, I want to thank Spyderco very much for sending this little guy along. They sent this to me as a review sample. I told them, as always, talk about the good, the great, the bad, the ugly. It might be a gem, it might be junk. They said, sure, give it an honest review and send it along. So great, no problem there. But thank you very much to Spyderco, and I've tried my best not to let that affect my review. Next thing, let's do a size comparison real quick. Here it is against, as always, the Spyderco Delicacy. You can see here, this is not a very large knife at all. And handle-wise, it's actually slightly smaller than your Delica here. Here it is against the Ontario Rat number 2 and the Rat number 1 over here. And I actually don't have any other knives by Brad Southard at the moment, but yeah, and then here it is against another weird Spyderco with a weirdly shaped blade. This is the Spyderco Gale Bradley Bowie. Sorry, not Bradley Bowie. This is the Ed Shemp Bowie. That's a different thing entirely. But anyways, there you go. That is, there's your size comparison. Next thing, this is by Brad Southard. As you can see here by the Southard Maker's Mark, which I always do love. And Brad is a well-known custom designer, as well as designer of the Southard Knives Mini Tolk, Avo, Tolk, etc., as well as the Spyderco Southard, Positron. He's a well-known designer, and this is another thing coming from him. And then finally, a quick note on the name. Although I'm probably going to mispronounce it in several places, I actually asked Spyderco, how the heck do you pronounce this thing? Because it's H-A-N-A-N, and it is Hanan. It's a Semitic word, apparently, meaning either grace or compassion, depending on your flavor of Semitic language. But anyways, that's what it is, and it's pronounced Hanan. So, yeah, there you go. Let's go ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of your Spyderco Hanan here. So first off, on the good side, this is using the new Spyderco Flipper pivot here. You can actually see inside there those coppery bearing races. Those are not phosphor bronze washers. Those are bearing races through and through, but it's also using that half stop pin thing that Spyderco's been doing lately. Look, it's a fine system, and it is an improvement over what you'd seen on the, what was the one that the Advocate had some trouble initially. They've now fixed a bunch of those, but either way, it's nice to see that system moving through. Next thing, clip on this guy is great. It is just a very, very basic piece of titanium that has been bent, but it's been bent well, it's been given enough ramp, it's been given enough, and it's in a good position here, and it's also reversible. No objection there whatsoever. And so that's always nice, and I appreciate that they're giving the lefties an option here, even though I'm not necessarily sure how compression lock, or how lefty-friendly a compression lock is of this configuration, because it seems kind of, but I may just be uncoordinated. Anyways, it's beside the point, though. Next thing, I do like the size a lot. Like I said, this is not a big knife. I mean, in terms of pocket size, it's actually smaller than your Delica by a slight margin here, and it's also, although it is a little bit on the chubbier side, but this is a very small knife, and it's a nice blade size. I mean, if I take a measurement here real quick, go out of millimeter mode, we are in the vicinity of like 3 inches or so, and pretty convincingly, it's right towards the edge there. But, you know, unless the cop is really angry at you, this is under 3 inches, and that's great. I appreciate that. That makes it legal in a lot of places, and frankly, it makes it very carryable. This is a pleasure to carry as a result. Next thing, blade on this guy is decent in a couple of ways. It is S30V steel, solid steel, no complaint there. It is ground to cut reasonably well, especially down here at the very bottom. It is actually pretty thin behind the edge, which I appreciate. It's a very quick plunge, even though it's got this whole recurve thing going on there. And of course, it does have the hole here for your nut and fancy zip tie mod. More realistically, Spyderco seems to put a hole in everything, and this, they decided that was where the hole was going to go. Completely non-functional, by the way. I even with my very, very small hands, I can't, well, there we go, I was able to get it out that time, but this is a flipper-only knife, so don't delude yourself. So there you go. Next thing, one thing I gotta say is that unlike the not the Advocate, the Sliver Axe, the Paul Alexander design, as you're closing this guy, the flipper tab, at least with my little fingers, doesn't tend to hit my, it doesn't tend to hit the finger here, because if I'm pulling the compression lock back, you can see here it's out of the way. Mind you, I do have, as a commenter once put, little bitch hands, and as a result, that's gonna be a little bit of a trouble for some people, potentially. Keep it in mind, though. But it is much better than the Sliver Axe in that I have not, as I've been using this, felt that happening much at all. frankly, I think ever. So that's good. Next thing, ergonomics on this are very good. It fits well in the hand. It's a little bit on the chubbier side, which actually does help to fill the hand. The clip is well designed. It's well positioned. No complaints there at all. I like very much the ergos on this guy, and especially with this jimping up at the top here, feels pretty solid. Gotta like that. So that's good. Next thing, the price on this guy honestly does seem fair. Look, it's $233. That's a fair amount of money, absolutely. But the thing is, it is a unique knife, and it is absolutely beautifully made. With things like, and I'll talk about some of the finishing in a second here, but, overall, this is a beautifully made titanium frame lock, compression lock, not a frame lock. Titanium frame lock's a thing, though. With this nice G10, I feel like it's well positioned against the competition price-wise, and I don't particularly have a strong problem with that, so that's good. And then finally, not quite finally, it has a very unique design. There is really nothing else out there like that. I mean, there are a couple of, like, pocket kukri-style blades. This isn't quite kukri because the front of it isn't far enough out, quite enough, but there are very few people doing blade shapes like this, potentially for good reason, but still, and overall, you don't get many compression lock flippers out there, because Spyderco's the only people who can really make compression locks, legally speaking. It's unique, and it's actually pretty well thought out as well. I mean, for instance, it has a small flipper tab that's just sliding down. I mean, as your hand slides past it in the pocket, isn't really in play. Yeah, it's pecking a little bit, but it's not bad at all. It has very nice jimping. It's got a nice little scallop on the other side here, so you can get compression lock access. I mean, on the whole, it feels like a lot of this knife has been really well thought out, so that's really good. And I appreciate that, and those are the good things. The thoughtful design, the fact that it is very unique, the price does seem fair, it's got very good ergos. Lefty or righty clip is no problem there. Flipper tab doesn't hit the finger, at least my little fingers. It's got decent blade. The size is great. The clip is great. And it has the new Spyderco pivot, so you don't have to worry about those compact washers getting problematic in there. On the great side, the finishing on this is really well done. I mean, this is from the Spyderco Taichung factory over there in Taiwan. And in the Spyderco world, Taiwan generally means excellent finishing. And here it means that again. Because you get things like this beautiful mirrory blade finish. Whoops. Got to change after work. You get this beautiful G10 here that's been nicely milled out and matches very nicely. As you're running your finger along this, it feels great. You see this beautiful backspacer here, absolutely flush fit with the titanium. This is just, I mean, overall, this is a superbly executed knife with one big exception that we'll talk about later, that Detent. But I'm a really big fan of how this knife was put together. It is beautifully built and is just absolutely excellent in fit and finish, as Spyderco's Taichung perfectly said that, as Spyderco's Taichung plant usually is. And so to me, that's what's greatest about this, guys, that this is just really well put together, even, I think, by Spyderco Taichung standards. So there you go. Let's talk about the bad side. First off, on the bad side, I'd kind of like to see a filler plate in the lefty hole. Look, this is not a big deal, and in some ways it actually does help because it provides an area of friction as you're pulling this out of your pocket. If you grab on both sides, this provides a little bit more friction, but I'd kind of like to see a little tiny filler plate in there, whether it's metal or just another chunk of G10, because if you need to swap the clip over, you can pop this off and then pop that filler plate off, and then you're able to pop that in. But look, it's not a thing, but it's going to pick up dust. It's going to pick up gunk over time. But let's face it, if you're carrying this guy, you're probably not out in the mud and the gunk and the gut, all that stuff. So there you go. Not a big deal, but it's a deal. Next thing, I gotta say the compression lock on this guy is a little hard to use, even with my relatively small hands. This little cutout definitely helps, but I feel like the only way that this is really comfortable is by just kind of pressing the tip of your index finger in there, and it just doesn't give you a lot of room to maneuver in there. It's good for the handle ergos, not having a big cutout like you get on, for instance, the PM2 or some of your other compression locks. I have the shame and handy. I do not. But either way, that is absolutely something you're going to want to keep in mind. It'll probably be a little easier if you've got fingernails, but this is a nice kind of reason why Smock uses for his compression lock flipper a button block-based compression lock system where there's just a button that presses this through rather than having to jam your finger in there. It's not a big deal, but it's kind of a thing. Next thing, the recurve on here, of course I have to mention. Now look, my knife gripe generally is with non-committal recurves. A recurve where somebody, puts just a little tiny bit of curvature, enough to make it hard to sharpen, but not enough to win you anything. Look, this one committed. This is a recurve. Recurve. Holy crap, is this Recurve? I mean, honestly, thinking about this initially, it's just like, why are you doing this? That's a weird aesthetic choice, but I actually wonder if it might be for safety's sake. Because take a look at this. Right here, when this knife is closed, the edge of the very heel of the blade is sitting right there, and the compression lock cutout lives right here. And so imagine if this were to go straight out across from here, and it were to be completely unrecurved. In that case, you would have this just a straight line along this angle of the flipper tab, and it seems like it would be very, very possible that the blade itself could cut your finger as you are holding this shut for the compression locking. As it is, this Recurve kind of gets the blade down and away from your finger during the compression lock, but unfortunately, it has some negative consequences, partly in that it is just going to be a total pain to sharpen. Oh my God. What I mean by that is on any kind of a fixed clampy system like your KME, or frankly, even on like your Edge Pro, that kind of thing, although with the Edge Pro, you've got a little more flex, you're going to really struggle to get all the way down into this little area here as you're doing this. I would have almost preferred had they, if this is in fact a safety issue, had they just put a big finger choil in here with a non-recurve blade. That way I could just put my finger down here, which I always do like a finger choil, and that way it's out of the way when you're doing this. The thing is, like I said, some people might look at that and go, wow, the blade's got an elbow. That's awesome. But for me, at least, that wasn't a big thing. And the fact that it's going to make sharpening suck on a lot of systems, especially clamped sorts of systems, fixed angle systems, and certainly on a flat bench stone, that's a problem. One thing to note, though, is that if you're using the Spyderco Shopmaker or the Golden Stone or something like that, in this case, actually, the Recurve doesn't really matter at all, because it's just going to be, I mean, the blade is just going to go right down the rod, no freaking problem there. So, there you go. I'm not a big fan of the Recurve, though, although I feel better about it now seeing that this was actually maybe a smart design to keep your finger safe in there. Then finally, on the bad side, the lock absolutely pinches your finger as you're opening this, because think about it. As you flip this knife, you're going to press your finger down, and your finger is going to kind of land in this area here. So as you fire this, and especially if you're not doing a full push button sort of an affair, because this really doesn't have a detent that's quite strong enough for the push button, your finger will come back and land right in this area. And when it lands in this area, the compression lock is going to move over there. So it just happens to be the case that, at least for me, every time I flip this knife, I end up getting pinched a little bit, either in the back of my finger if I'm going straight down, or in the whole thing over here. This is not a big deal, and you can actually kind of learn to dodge it. If you really put a lot of preloading on there, you can get it to fire with just a straight down push button flipper sort of sense. But very often I found a more reliable approach was actually to kind of skim the top of it. So don't light switch but to kind of do one of these. In that case, it does fire and it doesn't pinch you. But the thing is, there you're kind of relearning how a flipper works, and you still end up usually hitting this little area here, and it's not the most comfortable thing ever. Now look, is this dangerous? No. Is this really a big deal? No, but it is a little tiny pinch, especially as you start to get used to this guy. If it's your only knife, then fine, but if you're used to other flippers, this one's probably going to bite you a couple of times a day until you figure out exactly the technique. So, not a huge deal, but it's definitely a thing, and those are the bad things, is that the lock it's very easy for it to pinch your finger as you're firing the knife out. The Recurve, although it may be safety motivated here, I think I would have preferred a finger choil, and frankly, it's just going to make this really hard to sharpen. The compression lock can be a little hard to use, especially if you've got bigger fingers and no nails. And then finally, I would kind of like to see a filler plate here, and you can just pop it out through the other side, but whatever, not a big deal. What is a really big deal, and what is really ugly about this guy, is you probably already noticed this has a very weak detent. This is unfortunately just kind of a problem that Spyderco Taichung plant has, but watch. I didn't touch the flipper tab. I am going to keep my hands completely immobile here. Nothing involved. And it fires out. This is absolutely, and as you're flipping it, if you try and push button it, there is definitely, oh yeah, of course you work this time, but I've definitely found myself missing flips on occasion, especially if the knife is a little cold or something like that. Yeah, of course, now you're going to flip fine, just make me look like a jackass, but look, the fact is that this has a very weak detent on it, and far weaker than I think is really acceptable here. The sliver axe had the same problem, a very, very weak detent, and in practice, it gets a lot better if I put my hand completely steady, I don't give it any wrist at all, it's a lot harder to do, it's a lot harder to flip, but I just found myself as just learning to just throw some wrist in there to make it a little easier. The thing is, this detent, though, is really rough, and especially given that you do have the flipper tab sticking out here, it is tip up, so it's not a big deal safety-wise, but this is a really borderline dangerously weak detent with this flipper tab in there. Look, this is really frustrating to me because this is not the first time Spyderco has had detent issues. They get it right sometimes, but on this guy, on the sliver axe, on a bunch of other knives, they've just had detents that aren't strong enough. And even though the Taichung factory does incredible work, even though Taichung is the source of the best Spydercos, I feel like in general, they just are really bad at detent. So I hope that somebody over at Taichung goes and, attends the, as he hits the freaking phone thing. But I hope someone at Taichung, attends a school, the John Grimsmo School of Detent, stiffening or something like that, and gets that in gear, because right now it's a little disappointing, absolutely 100%. So that's the ugly to me, is that the detent on this guy is very, very weak, both for flipping and borderline for safety as well. So anyways, there you go. Final conclusions here. At some level, I do love that this knife was made. I mean, it is weird. It's beautifully made. I mean, Taichung, detent aside, did a really great job here. I feel like it's pretty reasonably priced relative to a lot of the competition out there, and it is absolutely pushing that technical envelope by moving compression lock flippers, which are a great idea, a little bit more into the world, and compression locks, being a great lock, both for strength, not that that matters, but also for being able to close the knife without your hands ever going into the blade bath. That's cool. And so, at a very real level, I like this, and I want to like this a lot, but unfortunately, there are a lot of annoyances here. The blade shape just doesn't honestly do it for me. I don't think a pocket kukri is really a great idea, and I think even if there was a safety thing motivating this, they might have been able to do that in a little bit of a nicer way. And it's going to be a total pain to sharpen. The compression lock is a little bit hard to use, although my little fingers are able to get in there without too much problem. The lock pinching is absolutely 100% a thing, and, I don't know. I feel like this could very easily, had that been the extent of it, been a good knife with a couple of things you want to keep in mind. A kind of a knife that you can adapt to. Like, you can just remember, okay, I need to flip up and backwards on this guy, and it's going to be just fine. Or, it's going to be weird, but you can sharpen it using some other kind of system here. But, unfortunately, the detent is sort of what kills the knife for me. It killed my enthusiasm, because now you have not only a knife that has a couple of other foibles, but is also not necessarily a super reliable deployer. Of course, again, it's going to prove me wrong as I'm doing this, but you saw me miss a flip at the very start of this freaking review, or at least I think that was this take. And so as a result, this knife goes from being something with some foibles to something that's kind of leaving me cold. And that's really unfortunate, because Spyderco does so many things right so often, and especially at Taichung. I wish that they had gotten those things right. Now, that said, look, is the detent a huge, oh my god deal? Well, look, at some level, yes. Every other company is getting this right. But at another level, if you are a person who finds the knife attractive enough, like you're looking at this and you're just like, oh my god, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I don't know who you are, but chime in the comments. You might be able to look past all those issues. You might just say, okay, you know what, I'll get my finger out of the way. I'll make sure I'm not getting pinched here. I'll give it a little extra wrist to make sure it's always deploying here. You might be able to look past it. This might be an absolutely great piece for you. But as for me, personally, with all these things on the table here, I can acknowledge that it's going to be it's a great idea, and that maybe an evolution of this guy is going to be an absolutely great piece. And I know that it could be CQI'd. If they just get that detent right, this would be, 50% better over freaking night. But as it stands, the current generation of this guy, it just is leaving me pretty cold. So there you go. I hope this has been interesting. Cool idea. I like that they tried it, but I don't know that it's something I'm going to recommend, and I really do hope they can have a little chat with the Taichung people about the tents, because it burned them on the sliver axe, and it burned them here again, and hopefully, sooner or later, they're going to stop getting burned by that. So there you go. Hope this has been interesting, that you found this review graceful and compassionate. Get it? Hanan? Graceful, compassion? And that you have yourselves just an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.